Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a new lecture. This week we're going to start a new module focused on architectural woodwork. It is going to be a relatively light module in terms of content, and we're going to spread it out over the course of 2 weeks. So hopefully it will give you a nice little break in case you have a lot of things on your plate right now. Your reading for this week is going to be a ballast reading that I have posted to the course module folder. And you're only going to read this from pages 1 to 7, okay? The entire chapter from this book that I am posting is roughly 17 pages, so this week we'll focus on the first 7 pages, and then next week is going to focus on the latter half of that, all right? All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. A lot of this content also is probably going to be familiar to you already. If you have taken the furniture design course, I believe that is the course that's offered in the fall of the second year. So most of you, I believe, have already taken that class. And if so, this should all be pretty familiar to you. All right. So architectural woodwork is custom shop fabricated millwork built primarily of lumber and used for interior finish construction and specialty furnishings. So this is going to include cabinetry, paneling, custom doors and frames, shelving, custom furniture, and interior trim. As we have noted here, architectural woodwork is commonly referred to as millwork. So as you're working as an interior designer, you will very often hear the word millwork being referred to. So just keep that in mind whenever you hear that word. You're usually talking about some sort of a wood product that is going to be custom made. The term finish carpentry, that is another word that you're going to hear thrown around. More so on the construction side of things, but that's going to refer to woodwork that is completed on the job site as opposed to in a shop. So millwork is usually only going to deal with things that are being custom built within a shop, such as cabinetry, and then finished carpentry is going to talk about site-specific carpentry. So, installing door frames, things like that. Okay. Interior designers commonly specify custom millwork on projects, and because of this, it's very important that you understand the construction and the fabrication process of millwork components. Okay, so the main things we're going to talk about today are how are some of these components constructed, and what are some of the options you have when you're specifying them. There's all kinds of different options you can choose. So cabinetry, for example, there's all kinds of different ways cabinetry can be made. So it's important that you're familiar with the terminology that's associated with those different types of cabinets and other millwork types, so that you can determine what is the best fit for your project, okay? All right, so first we're going to talk about lumber and veneers for architectural woodwork. All right, so these terms hopefully are familiar to you already, but if not, we're going to recap them here. So millwork can either be made of hardwood or softwood. Hardwood is a wood that comes from deciduous trees such as oak and maple. And softwood is a wood that comes from coniferous trees such as pine and fir. All right, so if we look at this picture down here, on the left we have our hardwoods, and those are usually just your basic trees that you see. Most trees, I would say, are typically hardwoods. These are your deciduous trees, and the common types of wood that you'll run into for architecture would be beech, oak, ash, and teak. And then some common softwoods would be pine, spruce, cedar, and fir. So softwoods come from coniferous trees as opposed to deciduous trees. And these are trees that I guess most people would just refer to them as pine trees. All right, any sort of a tree that has a pine needle that looks like a Christmas tree, that is going to be an example of a softwood tree. All right. Raw wood from trees is manufactured into either solid stock lumber or a veneer. Okay, so a solid stock lumber is a solid, or they're solid thick pieces of wood that are usually a ½ inch or thicker. And then a veneer is going to be a thin piece of wood that is usually less than 1/16 of an inch in thickness. Veneers are usually expensive wood species that are applied to inexpensive backings to make millwork appear fancier in a cost-effective way. All right, so let's say you wanted a custom piece of furniture to look like it's really fancy. It's made of an exotic wood species, but due to cost limitations, maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense to build whatever that piece of furniture is out of that expensive type of wood. So something you can do is have a wood veneer applied to the furniture. So maybe the piece of furniture is made out of something that's a little bit cheaper, maybe a more common species of wood, and then the manufacturer can take a thin layer. So here, for example, they'll take a thin layer and then they will overlay it over top of that inexpensive piece of wood to make it look like it's made out of that more expensive type of wood. If you look at this example here, this is a piece of engineered wood flooring. And engineered flooring, what they do is they will take a plywood core. So you can see down here at the bottom, there is a layer of plywood. And then on top of that, they'll add a thin veneer of a much nicer wood species so that the wood flooring itself appears to be made of a nicer type of wood. Okay. Types of solid stock lumber cutting. So there are a few different ways that pieces of lumber can be cut from a log. Each method produces a different grain pattern on the final piece of wood. So we're going to talk about some ways that an actual lumber mill will go and they will take wood and cut them to achieve certain effects, okay, with the wood grain. The first one is plane sawing. So the logs are sawn all the way through into strips. This is going to be the most efficient and least expensive sawing method, and the grain pattern usually has an irregular appearance, and it's also usually very pronounced, okay? The next one is quarter sawing. This is where logs are cut into quarters, and then the quarters are sawn perpendicular to a diameter line. The resulting grain pattern is fairly straight and uniform. These boards are more dimensionally stable, and they hold paint better than plane sawn boards. This is also going to be more expensive too than plane sawing. And then rift sawing. So this is when logs are cut into quarters and then the quarters are sawn in a radial pattern. The resulting wood grain has a very straight and uniform pattern. This method of sawing is the most complicated, expensive, and it produces the most waste. All right, so if we look at this little diagram here, this is going to explain it a lot better than just me talking about what is happening with these. So the first one we have is plane sawing. So you can see is a cross section of a log, and each of these rectangles is going to represent a piece of wood, like a board, that is produced from this sawing method. And then anything that is not a rectangle, so like around the edges here, you can see these little triangular shapes. That's all going to be the waste from the wood itself. So plane sawing is where we just take the log and we just cut it into flat planes, okay? And this is going to produce a grain pattern that sort of has these rings, okay? So when you just think about just a typical wood grain, this is probably what comes to most people's minds, is you sort of have those ring shapes, the growth rings, and they're usually irregular. And also this is very efficient because we're using almost the entire thing whenever we're creating our boards. Next to that is going to be quarter sawn, and you can see If you look at this sort of like a pie, they'll cut it into 4 pie-shaped wedges. Okay, and then what they do is they're going to cut each of those wedges perpendicularly into a series of boards. So if you look at the shapes that are not boards within this, you can see that there's a lot more waste. Okay, so these small little squares here between each of the wedges, and then also on the perimeter. This is going to produce even more waste than plain sawn. It's also more complicated and more expensive to do because it's a multi-step process. You're going to have to cut it into wedges, and then from there you're going to have to saw each of the wedges. So it just takes longer, and it's harder to do. But this is going to produce a very straight grain pattern where the grain is actually running parallel to the edges of the board. And then the last one, this is rift sawn. So this is the most complicated out of all of them, and this also produces the most waste. So if you look at this here, you can see the ratio of waste to actual board material that you're getting out of the log is going to be a lot less than some of the others. Okay, so it's not very efficient, and it's also more expensive, but basically what they're doing is they're again cutting these into quarters just like they did with quarter sawn, but instead of cutting each of these wedges straight across, they're instead cutting them in a radial pattern. So they're basically rotating the piece of wood each time they make a cut, and that is going to give you the straightest possible wood grain pattern. You can see that the wood grain pattern is also a little bit wider than the quarter sawn. Okay, so the individual rings here that are running through, they're just a little bit wider. But it's going to be a super uniform and straight grain pattern, very consistent. But this is also going to be the most the most complicated and expensive method, and is also going to produce the most waste. So it's not utilized as much as plain sawn and quarter sawn. But certain wood species, this is something that they have to do to avoid certain defects that are just inherent of certain types of wood. So for example, white oak, they will do this to avoid a particular defect that can appear if you saw them a different way. So types of veneer cuts, okay? So just like the solid stock wood, which is what we just looked at, there's also similar methods that are used to produce veneers, okay? So wood veneers are created by slicing logs with special knives rather than sawing them with blades. Just like solid stock lumber, the cutting method affects the wood grain pattern of the veneer. All right, so the first one is going to be rotary slicing. This is when you mount the logs on top of a lathe, and then the logs are turned against a knife. And what this does is it peels off a continuous layer of veneer. The wood grain pattern is very pronounced and is often undesirable for fine quality wood finishes, but this is also the most efficient and least expensive cutting method. Next, we have plain slicing, and that's very similar to plain sawing, and this is where you're going to cut the log in half, and then you're going to slice it across the growth rings. And this is also going to result in a pronounced and irregular grain pattern. And then lastly, we have rift slicing. This is where you are cutting the logs into quarters, and then they're going to be cut again at a 15-degree angle to the growth rings. This results in a very straight grain pattern that is usually used for white oak. All right, so here you can see this visually. The first one is rotary cut. We have our log, and then this is going to be mounted on a lathe. So it's going to have a little piece of metal holding this in the center on either end, and then it's going to be spinning. And as this is spinning, you're going to be putting a knife up against it. So this is very similar to like wood turning, if you've ever seen those videos where they can take like a small piece of wood and then they put it on a lathe and turn it, and then they use knives to shape it into either like an object or like a bowl or something like that. It's very similar. So they're just going to put the knife up to this, and then the knife is going to basically shave this, and it's going to shave it all the way down. And You can kind of equate this to like wrapping paper. So just think of the log as just a tube of wrapping paper. And then as you pull the wrapping paper off of the tube, it's kind of just peeling it away from the main tube itself, okay? And then the grain pattern that's going to be produced from this, you can see it's very irregular and kind of odd looking. So usually whenever you are using a veneer for something that is higher quality, you would want to avoid using a rotary cut piece of veneering just because it's not as desirable. But again, just the method that we are using here to produce that veneer, it's very efficient and very cost effective. So depending on the species of wood, it could be a good thing to specify for whatever the application is. Quarter slicing then, so quarter and rift slicing, these are very similar to one another, but basically that's just like what we saw with the quarter sawing and the rift sawing, where we're cutting the log into quarters and then we're creating very thin slices using a knife. So you can see here is our quarter, and then we're just cutting away at that in a straight line to produce these thin slices, and the resulting grain pattern is going to be very straight and very linear. You can see it here and you can see it there. And then lengthwise slicing, this is the same thing as plane slicing. So this is where you just cut strips of it just in a straight line. And this is the method that's going to produce the typical grain pattern that you associate with wood. All right. Next, let's talk about joinery details. So whenever we're putting two pieces of wood together, what is the method of joining those two pieces? So carpenters use a variety of methods to join pieces of wood together. The joinery method is determined both by functional and aesthetic requirements. Okay, so let's go here and take a look at the common joinery methods. So depending on the type of project or whatever the application is, whatever the type of millwork it is, if it's a piece of furniture, if it's a piece of cabinetry, usually that application is going to dictate the type of joinery that's being used. So if it's something that's a very fine piece of furniture, you're probably going to use more complicated joinery. And if it's something that is a bit simpler where the joinery is not going to be shown off as much, you're probably going to use a more basic form of joinery. All right, so if we are joining two pieces of wood together lengthwise, we have three common ways of doing that. The first one is going to be a half lap, where you're actually reducing the thickness of both pieces of wood to be the same, and they're going to be meeting up in the middle and kind of overlapping one another. And then usually they will be glued together. The next would be a finger joint. This is where you're kind of creating a zigzag cut into two pieces of wood, and then you're wedging the two pieces together and gluing them. This is a pretty strong joint because there's a lot of surface area here where you can apply the glue and it's going to stick it together really well. And then lastly is a scarf joint, where you're actually cutting the two pieces of wood at the same angle and then you're meeting them together. This is a very common joint that you would see for trim work inside of an interior, so like baseboards and crown molding. Whenever you have to install those, but maybe the piece of wood that you're using isn't long enough to make it from one end of the room to another, and you have to join two pieces together, the most common thing that the installer is going to do is they're going to use the scarf joint, because if you're just to take two pieces of wood and butt them up against each other, it's very common for them to kind of separate as time goes on, just because it's a pretty weak joint just butting them up together, and it's not going to look as nice. So they usually will just cut this on an angle, and then they will put the two sides against each other where they overlap, and they will glue that, and it's going to be a nice good joint for things like trim. Whenever you're joining together pieces of wood at a corner, so this could apply to either like cabinetry or even also trim work. Here there's a few different ways you can do it. These ones here are going to apply mostly to cabinetry, so like things like doors and stuff like that. The first one is going to be a rabbet, so this is where you are taking and um, you're subtracting away a little piece of the corner of one piece of wood, and then you're butting the other piece up against it. So you can see how this piece in front kind of jogs around the one that's coming up to it from this side. The next would be a dado, where you are sort of doing the same thing but in the middle of a piece of wood, and then the intersecting piece is actually being fully inserted into that slot. And then a dovetail, this again is sort of the same as a dado, but instead of it using just a square shape, it's going to use a triangular shape. And this is harder to do, but it locks the pieces of wood together a lot better. So the only way to get these apart would be to slide them upward as opposed to pulling them apart. So that's a little bit of a fancier joint that you would see in sort of finer furniture. A dado is more common in just regular cabinetry. Okay. And then these are examples of miter joints. So miters are where you're taking two pieces of wood and you're cutting the same amount of wood away from both pieces and you're joining them together at an angle. Okay, so this is very common for outside corners and inside corners when it comes to trim work. So like baseboards and crown molding, usually you will miter those. Another form of a miter is a shoulder miter, where the first part of the miter, so this is the outside corner, that is going to have the typical miter shape, but then at the inside of the miter, it's going to turn back into just a basic like rabbet shape. And the purpose of doing this is it's a little bit tougher, but it provides a better connection. So this is usually going to be a stronger joint than this one. And then a splinted miter is basically the same thing as a regular miter, except you're going to have an extra little piece of wood. So you're actually going to cut this, I guess, hole or slot in between the two pieces of wood that are being joined together. And then you're going to insert maybe like a rod or a dowel down into that slot, and then you're going to glue it all together. I guess a better word for that would be a biscuit. That's usually what they call it in woodworking, is a biscuit. So you're going to install that down into that slot and then glue it together, and that's probably going to be the strongest connection out of all three of these. But typically, miters are going to be the most common that you'll run into. So now we're going to talk a little bit about cabinetry, and this is the last thing we'll cover in this lecture. Cabinetry can be composed of either stock or custom components. So as you're working as a designer, depending on the project you're working on, you may specify something that is stock. So stock being things that are already pre-made, and those aren't tailored for a specific application, versus something that is custom that you are creating from scratch, and it's going to maybe fit the space perfectly. So stock cabinetry is common on projects where budget is a primary concern. These projects tend to be residential. So let's say you're doing a renovation project for, a house, and you're putting in maybe you're replacing the kitchen cabinets with something that's a little bit nicer, but the client can't afford to have custom built cabinetry that is perfectly tailored to the space. So what you can do is you can go to a cabinet manufacturer who has a bunch of stock components. So they may have a stockpile of like 3-foot wide cabinetry or 4-foot wide cabinetry. And you would just pull those individual components that they have, and you would arrange them in a way that fits the space, okay? Usually the layout is not going to be as nice as it could be as custom components, but depending on the project, you might not always be able to do that. You might just only be able to buy something that they have in stock. Or you can think about this as like you're redoing your kitchen, and you were going to like a home center like Lowe's or Home Depot, as opposed to like a custom cabinetry shop. All right, so when you go to Lowe's, they're just going to have a bunch of those in stock components that are prefabricated, and you're just going to buy them and put them in place. And then anywhere they don't fit properly, you're going to have fillers that you're going to put in between the cabinets, and it's not going to look as nice as something custom, but it would still work. So you can kind of think of it that way. So you're just buying something off of a shelf, basically, instead of having somebody make it exactly how you want it. But then custom cabinetry, obviously it's going to be more expensive, and this is going to be more common for projects where budget is less of a concern. So typically if you have a bigger commercial project, usually everything you're going to do is custom, and you're going to be working with a cabinetry shop or a manufacturer, and they're going to custom build all the cabinets for you. As a designer, you'll typically create cabinetry layouts, and you're going to select cabinetry styles. You will then work with a cabinetry manufacturer who will produce detailed shop drawings and build the cabinetry. So your primary job when you are developing these layouts and plans for cabinetry or any form of architectural millwork that's going to be installed is you're going to basically create the basic layout, and you would say this is the type of cabinet that I want here, and then you will hand that off to the manufacturer, and you would probably also select the style of cabinet. Okay, so there's a bunch of different looks to choose from as well. So you would give them those details, and you give them the basic plan and tell them what you want where, but then they're the ones who are going to be handling all of like the details and stuff. Okay, so they're the experts, and then they're going to be going in and creating the detailed drawings exactly of how everything is going to be constructed. But your main focus is going to be the layout and also the aesthetics. Okay. So base cabinets, the sides and bottoms of commercial grade base cabinets are constructed using 3/4 inch panels, and the backs of the cabinets are usually 1/4 of an inch thick. The top frame may be made of continuous pieces of wood, or they may consist of only corner blocks. So this image that I am showing here, this is a drawing of a wood cabinet, and if you look at the corners here, these are known as corner blocks that are holding each of the 4 corners together. This is something you would see on a cheaper quality cabinet, something that is more economical. Usually not something that is custom built, so it's not really as sturdy of a way to construct the cabinet. And if you see this, this is usually a good indicator of the quality of the cabinet. But more expensive cabinets, things that are built a little bit nicer, they'll usually have a continuous wood frame that runs along the inside, and it's just solid pieces of wood going all the way around. So the panels that are used to construct cabinetry are usually either solid wood, or they are a substrate such as a particle board that is faced with a plastic laminate. So if you think back more toward the beginning of this course when we talked about different, sheathing types, so when we were talking about subfloors and things like that, I mentioned we could have like a plywood, or we may have a different material like an OSB or a particle board. Particle board is an inexpensive material that's commonly used for cabinetry. And then what they will do is they will take that particle board, and on top of that they will install some sort of material. Usually it's going to be a plastic laminate, and that's what is actually the facing material that you're going to see on the outside of the cabinet. Or they could be solid wood, so if they're a bit nicer quality of a cabinet, maybe they'll be made of like solid oak or something like that is going to be actually stained and finished. Here you can see a section detail of a typical base cabinet. So what they usually do is they will manufacture the cabinet, and then they will bring it on site, and then they will screw it into the wall using special cabinet screws, and those are just going to be anchored right into the wall here. And then after that's installed, they will install the countertop. So the countertop is actually going to be made separate and then brought in later, and then put in after all the cabinets are already installed and in place. But if you look at this detail here, the basic construction of a cabinet is it's a basic box, and then on the front face of the box we have our doors and our drawers. We're going to look a little bit more here in a minute at the actual construction of these doors and drawers, because there's different styles associated with them that you can select. But then also at the bottom we have what is known as the toe kick. So this is the base, but then the toe kick is actually the recess here, how far back the base is set from the front face of the door. Usually that's around 3 or 4 inches, and this is usually also around 3 or 4 inches high. All right, and then the cabinet, typically it's going to be 3 foot high from the floor to the top of the countertop. Then the countertop is going to usually be around 1.5 inches in thickness. And then you may also have a tiny little piece of countertop that is extending above the top of the countertop surface. Usually this is going to be around 3 or 4 inches high, but it just really depends on the look you're going for. You may or may not have this. Is kind of optional. Now, as far as the countertop is concerned, how it's constructed, as I said, these are going to be built separately from the base cabinets, and then they're going to be installed at the job site. Often, especially in renovations, walls are not perfectly square. We like to think that they would be. Okay, we like to think that everything is perfectly straight, but if you would go to any wall in any building and put a square up to it, I guarantee you the square is not going to perfectly fit. There's probably going to be a gap between one of the walls and the square, or the angle might actually be a little bit acute, and it's not gonna fit perfectly. So that's something you run into all the time in the real world. Whenever you're installing things are kind of out of line and kind of out of whack. So if they were to build a countertop based directly off of the floor plans and construction drawings that you provide, whenever they would get to the job site and install it, usually it wouldn't fit properly. So what they will do is they will wait for all the cabinetry, the base cabinets, to be installed first, and then the guy who does the countertops will come in. He will measure out everything, and he will basically examine the contours of the wall after the walls have been installed, and that will allow him to make a countertop that perfectly fits the shape of the wall. All right, so that way there's no gaps between the front and between the back of the countertop and the front of the wall. Whenever he goes to put it in, he'll be able to fit it perfectly. So then upper cabinets are constructed in a very similar fashion to base cabinets. However, upper cabinets are not as deep as base cabinets, and additionally, you have to give special consideration to the bottoms of base or upper cabinets, since the bottoms of them are exposed. Also, they're going to be anchored to walls using special cabinet screws. Because of this, since they're anchored to the walls, you have to take into consideration the construction of the wall that is going to be holding the cabinet. In some cases, you may also need to specify wood blocking be added to the existing wall structure so that it can properly support the cabinet. So if you look down here at this image, you can see these rows of wood that are between the studs. What these are wood blocking that are being installed so that whenever you're hanging your cabinets, you have something to actually screw the cabinets to. So they're going to take the cabinets and they're going to kind of hoist them up into place, and then they will take special screws and they will screw them through the back face of the cabinet directly into this wood blocking or into the studs. Okay, so this blocking isn't always needed, but in certain cases it is needed, especially if you are working within a building that has steel studs. Very often between those steel studs, they will install this wood blocking so that they have like a proper anchor point for those upper cabinets to be installed onto. Here's an example of the type of wood that they use to mount the type of screw that they use to mount the cabinetry to the wood blocking or to the studs. So this screw is usually going to be pretty long, and the threading on the screw itself is going to be pretty coarse, meaning there's not very many threads as opposed to other types of screws. And they usually have this very wide circular shape here at the top. Here's a detail of what an upper cabinet looks like installed. So here you can see they're saying if this is a metal stud wall, usually you're going to have some kind of a wood blocking here within the stud bays. And then basically they're going to be taking and installing these screws directly through the backs of the cabinetry directly into that blocking or into the studs, okay? Here, if you look, like I said, the upper cabinets, the bottom is going to be exposed. So again, you have to give special consideration to that and finish it off if necessary, okay? And usually, depending on where this is, you may also have an optional light fixture that's going to be installed underneath there that's going to provide you with good task lighting, especially in like a kitchen. This may also be mounted directly up to a soffit. So if you're in a kitchen, you have like a soffit up here, they may also screw it directly into that upward. Okay, and then the last thing we'll discuss is the construction of doors and drawers for cabinetry. So there are going to be 4 basic types of like front face construction for these cabinet drawers and doors. So the first one is going to be inset or flush. And this is where the front faces of the drawers and the doors are flush with the cabinet frame. So if you look at this image here, the space around all these cabinet drawers and doors, this is our frame. And then here you can see the drawers and the doors themselves. And they're actually in the same plane as the frame. Okay, so if you look at this in a section, here's the detail of that. Here is our frame. Okay, there's the face frame right there on the front. That would be this piece here, these vertical pieces. And then this piece up here is what's actually within the cabinet itself. And then here you can see are the drawers and doors, and they're in the same plane as the face frame, okay? So it's just a continuously straight plane. Now, the other type of cabinet that you can have is what's called an overlay cabinet, and the next 3 styles we'll actually be discussing are all overlay. So basically, there's 2 main types that you can have, being inset or overlay. Okay, so what an overlay is it's basically you're taking the drawer or door and you're installing it over top of the face frame. Okay, so if you look at the section here, here's our frame again, but this time you can see the door or drawer is actually overlapping that, and then you have the next one. So then if you look at this in an actual view, you basically have a tiny little gap between them, and that's what the full means. It means that the drawers and doors are almost fully butting up against each other, and the gap between them is very minimal. And this has just a nicer, more modern look to it than a lot of other cabinet types. This is a very popular look that is being used nowadays. You also have what's called the reveal overlay, or this is a half or a partial overlay is something that they also call it. So this is what I think of when I think of just like a basic typical cabinet. What you're seeing is basically the cabinet drawers and doors overlap with the frame just like they did in the previous example, except the overlap is not nearly as significant. Okay, so this space here between the 2 doors, that's what's known as a reveal. And that space is going to be much more significant than it was on this previous example here where this is very tight. So it's basically the same thing where you're overlapping it with the structure, but you're going to have just a bigger gap between each of the doors and drawer fronts. And then the last one is a lipped overlay, and this is basically the exact same as this one. That's why I don't have a picture of it, but if you look at the section of it, if you remember when I discussed the rabbet a little bit ago when we were talking about joinery, basically the back sides of these door and drawer fronts have a little rabbet taken out of them. So that way they kind of fit around the frame that's sitting behind them. So these kind of just sat on top or in front of the frame, and these actually kind of sit around the frame that sits behind them. All right. So that's it for this week's lecture. Not too much stuff, and it's hopefully should be a lot of review from some of your furniture design coursework that you did probably last semester. All right, next week we're gonna pick back up with a look at architectural woodwork in terms of trim and paneling. So make sure that you read the chapter on this and you're familiar with everything that is discussed in the chapter, and we will pick back up with this next week.